Mike had plans, dreams, heck, I even had a secret savings account set aside for a special trip around the world we were planning to take in just a few years. I stood about 15 feet away from my wife, Tracy, as she chatted with a few of her coworkers during her employer's annual staff meeting at a small college in mid-September. I watched as her face flushed a deep crimson and then continued to glow pink while talking to Rafe Searcy, the new associate professor of English literature, and Janet Barnes from the administration, who worked alongside Tracy. Given that this was a Christian college, it seemed unlikely that either of her colleagues had shared an inappropriate joke, so the only explanation for Tracy's reaction was clear: she was highly aroused. In that moment, a question I hadn't even voiced was answered. After 23 years of marriage and 25 years together, you get to know your partner inside and out, even if you don't always consciously notice the details. If you're paying attention, the signs are unmistakable. Just 10 minutes earlier, I had thought our marriage was perfect, and Tracy was an almost ideal wife. Now, I was piecing together recent oddities in her behavior that, until now, I hadn't recognized as alarming. Tracy and I had been best friends, lovers, and parents to two wonderful children. We could spend our days together and never grow tired of each other's company. We could talk about anything from sex to history, and our conversations were always filled with laughter. I've always believed that a true test of marital compatibility is a long road trip. If you can survive that without wanting to strangle each other, you should definitely marry. Tracy and I fit that profile. Our sex life had always been fulfilling. Sure, it had cooled from the fiery passion of our early years, but it had rekindled after our youngest daughter left for college the previous year. Being empty nesters had seemed to reignite our desire. We oscillated between slow, passionate lovemaking and more vigorous sessions 3 or 4 times a week. Both of us were in good shape for our age, thanks to our regular gym routines. At 45, Tracy had long blonde hair, a voluptuous figure, and was probably about 15 pounds heavier than she was before having children, but she carried it well. As for me, I was 20 pounds more muscular than when I left school, with 25 years of experience in pleasing my wife. 2 months ago, something had shifted. The change, though mostly positive, was significant enough that I couldn't ignore it. Tracy, who had always been a willing participant in our sex life but rarely initiated, suddenly began to take the lead as much as I did. Our physical connection was electrifying, but the focus of our encounters had shifted from emotional intimacy to just physical pleasure. It was amazing, but the change was undeniable. I never questioned it then, but in retrospect, I realized it was a mistake. During the event, Tracy and Rafe were rarely more than 5 feet apart when walking. Now that I knew what I was looking for, it became clear that Tracy's glow intensified whenever she was near Rafe, even if I was present. This glow would usually vanish when I approached, but as soon as I was out of sight, she was right back with him, engaging in intimate conversation. I kept a close eye on them throughout the evening, though it didn't require much effort. Tracy seemed to be entirely absorbed in Rafe's presence. She never looked around for me and made sure to touch him lightly at every opportunity. My emotions fluctuated from nervousness and fear to outright rage as I came to terms with what I was witnessing. The reality of the situation was undeniable, and the truth of what I saw was both heartbreaking and infuriating. It felt like the end of my marriage was imminent. I practically had to drag my wife away from Rafe at around 11 p.m. When I showed up and told her it was time to leave, the anger that flared up in her eyes was unmistakable. For a moment, she seemed ready to confront me, but then she backed off. Her glance, though fleeting, was sharp enough for me to notice. After 23 years of marriage, I had come to recognize those subtle signals. Usually, our conversations during the drive home flowed easily, but that night, I chose to remain silent, waiting for Trace to start a discussion. She appeared lost in thought, staring out the passenger window, until she finally realized the silence was growing uncomfortable. In a bid to fill the void, she launched into a superficial commentary about the college president's wife's fashion choices. I wasn't very engaged. Wow, "I'm really tired," Trace said when we arrived home. "I'm going to bed." I wasn't sure if she was avoiding further conversation or if she simply wanted me to head to bed so she could process whatever emotions were brewing. I didn't take the bait and told her I planned to watch some TV. I think she looked disappointed. The next day was Saturday, which meant I had the entire day to work outside. The yard work gave me a chance to calm down and think things through. If Trace was aware that things were unraveling, she did a remarkable job hiding it. The following week, the atmosphere at home felt noticeably tense. I tried to act nonchalant, but I found myself checking the Find My Phone app on my iPhone several times a day. In every instance, Trace was exactly where she was supposed to be. At night, she seemed more than willing to be intimate. She was a bit reserved the first night, but quickly returned to her usual self. I made sure to satisfy her, giving her several intense orgasms. By the following Tuesday, things took a drastic turn. The Find My Phone app indicated that Trace had gone home at lunchtime. 15 minutes later, I quietly entered the house and confirmed my worst fears: our marriage was over. The noise coming from our bedroom was unmistakable, so I didn't need to climb the stairs to know that Rafe was indeed with her. My heart raced as I heard Trace exclaim, "Oh God, baby, you're the best." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. It took every ounce of self-control not to burst into the bedroom and confront Rafe. I knew that if I let my anger take over, I wouldn't stop until I had done something irreversible. Despite the urge, I refrained, knowing that no one was worth risking prison over. "Trace, I understand it might sound self-serving to claim that I loved my husband more than anything in the world, but it's the truth. I loved him deeply for 25 years and hoped to continue loving him for at least another 25. However, I must also admit that I have been seeing someone else. This lover was so captivating that I couldn't bring myself to end the affair, even though I knew that ultimately, it would be the only way to salvage my marriage. Mike, my wonderful husband, would be devastated to learn about the affair. That's why I did everything possible to keep it hidden. I wasn't naive enough to think I'd never get caught. I knew that the longer it went on, the more likely I was to be discovered. Mike has been my rock for the past 25 years. We were married for 23 of those years and have 2 incredible children. He was my best friend, my soulmate, and a great lover. We shared everything and laughed a lot, well, until recently. I never intended to take on a lover when I met Rafe. He walked into the administration building just a couple of days before school started, and without exaggeration, my life changed. Rafe, at 30 years old, stood 6'2", was very fit, with short brown hair and soft gray eyes. He was handsome but not quite a George Clooney. That day, I couldn't focus on anything else, and when I got home, I'm sure I nearly overwhelmed Mike with my fervor. He fell asleep exhausted, but with a smile on his face. Never let him know that I wasn't thinking about him during our time together. I continued to pursue Mike until he was completely spent. For the next 2 weeks, everything seemed to fall into place. My dear husband unwittingly gave me the perfect opportunity to act on my desires when he had to leave town for the night the following Wednesday. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I could barely contain my excitement when I called Rafe on Monday morning and invited him to lunch that Wednesday afternoon. I had already checked Rafe's schedule and knew he was free that afternoon. I took administrative time off from work. Rafe met me at a quaint Italian restaurant, and our lunch was delightful. We chatted, laughed a lot, and I found it difficult to keep my hands from lingering on his arms and hands. I blushed repeatedly and felt as giddy and inexperienced as a teenager on her first date. Although we hadn't discussed sex directly, the air between us was charged with anticipation. Rafe's smiles and lingering touches spoke volumes. Being the gentleman that he is, Rafe picked up the bill and asked where I lived. "I live just 10 minutes away," I told him. "Leave your car, I'll drive you home." My voice sounded more confident than I actually felt. Knowing that Mike wouldn't be back until Thursday evening eased some of my anxiety about what was to come, but I still couldn't deny my nervousness. At 45 and having had 2 children, I didn't have the youthful physique Rafe was probably used to, but my love for Mike was undeniable. Nonetheless, I was determined to savor this experience with Rafe without guilt. I parked my car in the garage and closed the door behind me. The next 10 hours were some of the best of my life. Rafe clearly felt the same connection I did, and everything we did together was phenomenal. Although I wasn't a virgin when I met Mike, I had always considered him an exceptional lover. But with Rafe, it was as if everything had been reset. The intensity and pleasure of our time together were extraordinary. When Rafe finally left to get an Uber to pick up his car, I felt utterly disoriented and overwhelmed. I remember there was a lot of screaming and some crying. I'm pretty sure it was me, though I could hardly swear to it. I had experienced being utterly spent and desired, and I was fully aware of my desire for this new relationship. "You're an incredible woman, Tracy," Rafe told me. That was probably the best sex of my life. Rafe understood exactly what Tracy McQuinn meant when she called me. I saw her reaction 2 weeks ago in the office building. I knew we would end up together after lunch, even though I hadn't explicitly said so. Tracy was undoubtedly attractive, pretty face, big breasts, long blonde hair. Sure, she had a few extra pounds, but it only made her more desirable. I noticed her wedding rings when we first met, but that didn't deter me. Married women often have more experience, and being a little unconventional only seemed to add to their allure. After our wonderful lunch, Tracy took me to her home, and we spent most of the day indulging in physical pleasure in her marital bed. Her husband was out of town, so instead of just a quick affair during lunch, we had all day to explore our desires. Tracy proved to be the most physically responsive woman I've ever known. As the Uber dropped me back at my car in the restaurant parking lot, I hoped for many more days like this. The following week, I was stunned by Tracy's deceitfulness. She continued her Oscar-worthy performance of the ideal wife while I quietly prepared for our impending divorce. I met with my attorney the next Wednesday morning. She informed me that Tracy would be served with divorce papers the following Wednesday. Despite living in a no-fault state, I was determined to move forward with the legal proceedings. On the grounds of adultery, my situation seemed petty, but it was the reality I was grappling with. I had no idea what had driven my wife into the arms of another man, or if it was simply that he was 15 years younger than me. Regardless, this wasn't just a fleeting drunken affair. If I needed more confirmation, the Find My Phone app showed that Trace had gone home for lunch 3 more times in the past 10 days. I didn't need to go home to understand that Trace wasn't returning just to eat cheese sandwiches. I chuckled bitterly at the thought. At some point during this period, I went into our snack bar to grab a pack of brown sugar cinnamon Pop-Tarts. To my surprise, they were gone. The day before, I had eaten the penultimate pack, and I knew there was one more left. Trace didn't eat them because she despised Pop-Tarts. Clearly, Rafe not only had an affair with my wife but also helped himself to my snacks. Damn him. Thursday morning, I woke up feeling like $1,000,000 after the best sex of my life. Logically, I should have felt guilty, but in reality, all I wanted was more. I waited until noon to call Rafe. "My husband won't be home before 9 o'clock. If you come right after, I'll be free at 5. We'll have time for one more round, maybe 2, I said cheerfully. "Drive your car into the garage. I love a woman who knows what she wants," Rafe replied. We made slow, passionate love the first round and then had even more intense sex the second time. It was just as exhilarating as the day before. After Rafe left around 7:30, I quickly dismantled the bed and changed the sheets for the second time in 2 days, making sure to hide both sets at the bottom of the laundry basket. I felt a surge of satisfaction as I jumped into the shower. 90 minutes later, Mike walked through the door, and I embraced him tightly. I genuinely loved this man. Even though I felt a pang of guilt when Mike practically pulled me into the bedroom for another round of lovemaking, This was the first time in my life I had been with two different men in one day. It was an incredible experience. Honestly, it was fantastic, I whispered to Mike as we cuddled together after our second session of the evening. You're amazing. Mike was a wonderful lover in his own right, but the connection I shared with Rafe was a different kind of extraordinary. It was as if we were engaging in something entirely separate from what Mike and I had. Sex with Rafe was about raw, incredible physical sensations, while sex with Mike was about emotional intimacy. I couldn't feel guilty for experiencing something so extraordinary. I knew this couldn't last forever, but I intended to enjoy it while it did. Then came Wednesday, the day I knew Tracy was supposed to be served with divorce papers at 10 a.m. Just 2 minutes past, my phone rang. "No, Mike, I don't want a divorce," Tracy screamed when I answered. "I don't want a cheating woman as my wife, but we don't always get what we want, do we?" I replied. "I can explain," she pleaded. "I made a decision for myself, and it's something we need to discuss." Tracy's voice was shaky, full of tears. "Since you've ignored our vows, I made a decision for myself as well, so no, we don't need to discuss your decision," I said, ending the call. At work, I managed to be productive, but I knew what awaited me at home, and Tracy didn't disappoint. "Don't you think you should have talked to me before filing for divorce?" she screamed as I walked in. "After all, we've been married for 23 years. What are you saying? Those 23 years didn't seem to matter to you when you kept cheating on me," I shot back. From her tear-streaked face and smudged makeup, it was clear that Trace had been crying. I, too, wasn't feeling particularly cheerful. "I love you, Mike," she said, trying to sound earnest. "What I had with Rafe was just physical. It was a decision for myself. I finished for her," I said, my voice cold. Tracy looked worried. "I'm sorry I hurt you, but I think you're overreacting. Can we talk about this?" "I don't understand what you're talking about, Tracy. You cheated multiple times, probably more than I even know," I said. "I know it looks bad. I know it was just a decision for you, but why don't you explain it to me?" I thought my sarcasm was obvious, but clearly, Tracy was struggling to grasp the full extent of my disdain. Tracy seemed buoyed by my reaction, flashing me a genuine smile that was almost unnervingly reassuring. It was as though we shared some inexplicable, profound physical connection. "Is this the best sex you've ever had?" she asked, her eyes widening with a mixture of fear and vulnerability for the first time. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. "Did you hear me?" she asked, her voice trembling with both fear and desperation. "Do you want me to replay it for you? I was at home last week, and you two were so preoccupied that you didn't even notice me. I can't fix this mistake." At least she had the decency to lower her gaze in shame. "It was purely physical, Mike. I love you more than I can put into words. Can't we at least try to work through this? I know I've hurt you, but I also know you still love me." Her words struck a chord. As painful as it was, she was right about one thing: I still loved her, though perhaps not as intensely as I did 2 weeks ago. After 25 years of love, it doesn't simply vanish overnight. Even though I knew engaging in this affair was risky, I was still stunned when I was served with divorce papers at my office on Wednesday afternoon. I had no inkling that Mike knew about my affair. To make matters worse, he not only knew but had apparently caught Rafe and me in the act and even had a video recording. The situation was compounded by the fact that he had heard me tell Rafe that he was the best I had ever had. I realized I would never be able to fully explain the connection Rafe and I shared to Mike, but I was determined to make things right. I began by proposing that Mike agree to let me keep Rafe as an outside lover while we continued our marriage. As a last resort, I suggested seeing a psychologist to help us navigate this tumultuous time. Mike agreed, and our first session with the therapist did not go well for me. The consultant was a woman, and like Mike, she seemed unable to understand my irresistible attraction to Rafe. I had hoped she would offer more empathy or support, but instead, Her response was harsh and critical. "So your vows meant nothing to you, Mrs. McQuinn?" she asked after I had finished explaining my side. "No, they mean everything to me," I insisted, "but this is different. It's unlike anything I've ever felt before. You're a woman, you've felt arousal before. It's like that, but so much stronger, as if I've been under some sort of spell." The look on her face made it clear she didn't believe me. Mike sat there, visibly stunned. It seemed men weren't the only ones accused of thinking with their lower brains, women were just as guilty, according to divorce statistics, the consultant said calmly. "Yes, the phenomenon of lightning strikes is real, but most people understand they have a choice to ignore it. You've decided to give in to your base desires." I couldn't believe this woman was essentially accusing me of having no self-control. It felt like she was labeling me as a cheat. Then she asked a question that probably sealed the fate of our marriage. "If Mike could forgive you and take you back, do you think you'd be able to resist your physical desires and remain faithful?" I was stunned. I had hoped she would support me, but I was too afraid to answer. Mike would know if I was lying, and I could never fool him. "I love you, Mike. Please, could you work with me on this? I know it's not ideal, but this is the best sex of my life. Don't ask me to give this up." I cried a lot during that session, glancing at Mike, hoping for a sign that his resolve might be softening. In the end, he admitted that he still loved me, but his eyes were as cold as stone. "I'm sorry, Tracy. I really love you, but I won't condone your cheating, and I can't forgive what you've already done. I'm sorry I wasn't enough for you." "You are more than enough for me, Mike," I pleaded. "I love you. I don't love Rafe. I'll give him up if it means saving our marriage. Please don't give up on us." Mike's response was harsh. "I didn't do this to us. You abandoned us the moment you slept with him. Don't blame me. I never realized how selfish you were. It's always been about you, and you just don't love me as much as I love you." 2 weeks after our last session with the consultant, I was in my bedroom with Rafe again. I didn't know if Mike was watching, but in that moment, I didn't care. I had seen Rafe on campus the day before and had called him for a lunchtime date. The sex was as fantastic as ever. 6 months later, the divorce was finalized. During those months, Rafe and I were intimate dozens of times. Each encounter was extraordinary. Rafe became my kryptonite. I loved Mike, but my desire for Rafe was undeniable. I knew I'd never win Mike back because of this, but he didn't love me enough to accept Rafe. It was a bitter realization. Mike, I couldn't believe Tracy was actually trying to persuade me to let her keep her lover while remaining married to me. "If you truly love me," she argued, "why is this nonsense even a question? Forget it. There's no way we're staying married," I declared firmly. I might have been a clueless fool, but I wasn't going to be a complete idiot. I was astonished that our marriage counselor didn't seem to be living in the same fantasy world as Trace. During our very first session, the counselor practically labeled my wife and things only deteriorated from there. By the 4th session, she told Trace that I would never back down from my position and that she supported me. I thought Trace was going to collapse right then and there when the counselor ended our sessions. I wasn't sure if Trace had enlisted our daughters to plead her case, but both of them made a concerted effort. "You're destroying the family, Dad," my youngest daughter cried when I broke the news. "No, sweetheart, I'm not destroying the family. Your mother did that. I'm just making it official," I explained. She twisted her face and furrowed her brows, clearly grappling with the situation. "You're probably right, Daddy," she finally said. I hadn't intended to ruin Trace's marriage, but I saw it more as a problem for her and her husband. I knew she was deeply in love with him, but our physical connection was incredible, almost otherworldly. If she wanted me, I was more than willing to oblige. I suppose I couldn't blame him for not wanting to be cuckolded, but that was between him and Trace. My concern wasn't to question why Trace stayed away from me for 2 weeks after Mike filed for divorce. When Mike didn't relent and take her back, we resumed our romance. In fact, things seemed to improve because, with Mike out of the way, I received all of Trace's physical attention. I must admit that sex with Trace was the best I had ever experienced. Despite this, I never expected our relationship to last long. At 45, Trace was not suited for marriage in my view. I wanted to have my own children, and she already had 2 grown children. If she could betray someone she claimed to love more than anything, what could I expect from her? I continued to look for someone else, though I kept this to myself, knowing Trace had enough on her plate after losing Mike. Everything changed when I met Lucy Ralston about a year after Trace's divorce. At 24 years old, with short brown hair and a dancer's lithe body, we hit it off immediately. I didn't mention Lucy to Trace at first, but after about 2 months, I finally confessed. I knew I had hurt Trace's feelings, but it seemed she didn't really love me. While we were physically connected, emotionally we were just friends. When Lucy and I decided to be exclusive, I had to end things with Trace. "But I abandoned my husband for you," Trace cried when I told her it was over. "That's not true," she retorted. "You left your husband to have sex with me. We never existed as a real relationship, it was all about fantastic sex and that was your choice, not mine." "My choice is to have a wife and family," I said firmly. Trace was devastated when Rafe told her he was going to be exclusive with Lucy and that their affair was over. "I cried when he told me," she admitted. Rafe looked at me with what I could only interpret as pity. "That's right," I said, "but you left your husband to be with me." Even though I knew she was right, it didn't make it any easier. The situation became even more awkward when my children found out. Mike didn't sugarcoat the breakup, bluntly telling them that I had cheated on him several times for what he described as the best sex of your mother's life. The kids were upset with me, but eventually, they came to terms with it. Telling them a year and a half later that Rafe had left me for a younger woman only made me look pathetic, even to myself. I didn't ask them to keep it from their father, but I hoped they would. When the kids came home for Christmas, my oldest daughter casually asked if they would meet my boyfriend. At that moment, I admitted that we were no longer together. "So, you gave up a quarter of a century of love with Dad for a couple of years of sex with some younger guy?" she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Oh wait, sorry, a couple of years of the best sex of your life," she corrected herself. I lowered my eyes to the floor, unable to respond. Losing Rafe didn't affect me as deeply as losing Mike. Rafe had been an extraordinary lover, but Mike was my everything. Coming home to an empty apartment every day after work felt like a dagger to my heart. It was the kind of loneliness that gnawed at your very soul. But there was a silver lining, Rafe. Our passionate encounters several times a week had become a lifeline, a way to chase away the shadows of solitude. When he left, however, the void was palpable. The loneliness that replaced him was far worse than I'd anticipated. At first, I was intrigued by the idea of dating again. To my surprise, most of the men who showed interest were in their 30s and even 20s. Maybe, despite being 47, I didn't look as bad as I thought. I found enjoyment in the company of a few of these men, but none compared to the quality of what I'd had with my ex. Perhaps it was because I hadn't dated in so long, but the shift in men's expectations over the past quarter century was startling. Younger men, in particular, seemed to expect sex on the first date, and if that didn't happen, there often wasn't a second chance. It wasn't that I was prudish, rather, I wasn't willing to jump into bed with just anyone. I remembered my experiences with sex, it had generally been good, and most of my partners seemed pleased. The younger men were particularly fond of my fuller figure, while older men seemed to appreciate more of the intimate, oral pleasures. Despite the variety, most of the encounters felt like just sex. I missed making love, the deep, emotional connection that came with it. During conversations with my children, I tried to subtly inquire about Mike. I didn't think he was seeing anyone, which meant there was a glimmer of hope that I could win him back. Although I knew the chances were slim, I couldn't understand why he wouldn't be open to dating me if he was seeing other divorced women. We had shared a wonderful marriage for 23 years. I realized I would need to take the initiative if there was any chance of reconciliation. "Mike, would you like to grab coffee sometime?" I asked when I called him a few months later. "I know I hurt you, and I'm truly sorry. I really miss the companionship we had, the kind where we could sit and chat over coffee, maybe even share a meal. I'd love to reconnect." To my relief, Mike responded cautiously but positively. "Sure, Tracy. I think we could do that. I've missed your company, and I feel like I'm in a better place now." We arranged to meet at Starbucks the following Saturday. When Tracy walked in, I was taken aback. It had been 2 years since I'd seen her, but she looked as stunning as ever. Time had been kind, she didn't seem to have aged at all. Her shoulder-length hair framed her face beautifully, and the tight sweater she wore accentuated her figure. With minimal makeup, her natural beauty shone through. I stood to greet her, momentarily unsure whether to hug her. Tracy solved that dilemma by stepping into my personal space, planting a gentle kiss on my cheek, and hugging me warmly. I hugged her back, a smile breaking across my face despite myself. "How come no one has snatched you up yet?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. She blushed charmingly, her smile widening. "I guess not everyone has such good taste," she replied. We ordered coffee and enjoyed a couple of pastries. Our conversation flowed easily, reminiscent of the days when we were married. It was so pleasant that we ended up ordering a second round of coffee. "This was fun, Tracy," I said as we prepared to leave. "How about we do lunch next time?" Her eyes widened in surprise at my invitation. "That sounds great," she said softly. 2 weeks later, I called to arrange our lunch date. It had been over 25 years since I had gone on any kind of date, and none since our divorce. Although I had been devastated by what Tracy had done, I tried to maintain a facade of indifference to the outside world. In reality, the pain was still raw, and I had stayed away from women since the divorce. On a Saturday afternoon, Tracy and I enjoyed a delightful lunch at our favorite Italian restaurant. I could tell she hoped I would invite her to my home afterward, but instead, I walked her to her car, gave her a friendly kiss on the cheek, and said goodbye. Over the next year, we continued to enjoy several dinners together, but I hesitated to go beyond that. It gave me more control over the situation, in my opinion. Dinner often leads to what happens afterward, and I had no desire, and couldn't afford, to let things go in that direction. Tracy and Mike had clearly grown wiser over the years. Mike seemed to enjoy our time together, but he never suggested having dinner. I figured that at some point, he'd propose it, and it would just be a small step towards spending the night together. I knew he wasn't dating anyone, and I hoped that if I could really impress him one day, I might have a chance to rekindle our connection. But he never gave me that opportunity. Dining at IHOP certainly wasn't the prelude to anything more intimate. Taking the hint, I began seeing other people. It was just something I had to accept. Tracy had tangled my emotions so much that I didn't date anyone else for 5 years. I didn't view my lunches with her as dates, though I knew she had other expectations. One day, while browsing through my favorite liquor store, searching for a new tequila to try, I felt a presence to my right. It turned out she was doing the same thing. She seemed pleasant enough, so I decided to share my extensive knowledge of distilled spirits. I was just being friendly. "Do you prefer tequila straight or in cocktails?" I asked with a smile. "I never dilute good tequila," she replied confidently. "I drink it like I drink my coffee, straight, no additives. Margaritas are good for parties, but when I really want to drink, I go pure." Wow. Here was a woman who drank tequila properly. I'd never met a woman who knew her tequila like that. I turned to face her, realizing how attractive she was. No rings on her left hand, either. She seemed a little younger than me, with curly dark brown hair that fell almost to her shoulders, pale skin, and sparkling blue eyes. I assumed she had Irish roots like mine. I didn't realize I was staring until I heard her voice again, asking me a question. I noticed her subtle grin as I returned to reality. I must have blushed. "I'm sorry," I said, feeling a bit embarrassed. I was just lost in thought. It's not every day I meet a beautiful woman who knows how to appreciate good tequila. She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "And what kind of world is this, Mr. Tequila Expert?" "Luke Serville, at your service," I said with a sheepish grin. "And ma'am, I must apologize for that. My parents instilled good manners in me, but no, you don't look like my mother. I loved her dearly, but even on her best days, she didn't look as stunning as you." I winced internally as the words left my mouth. She looked surprised, then her expression shifted into a sly smile. I took a good look at her tight, curvy figure and replied, "So, why Loserville, Mr. Tequila Expert? If we're being honest, it doesn't seem like you'd have any trouble getting a date or two." "I haven't been on a date in 5 years, since my divorce from my unfaithful wife," I said quietly. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that," she said, looking genuinely embarrassed. An awkward silence followed, but thankfully, she broke it. "So, what do you recommend?" she asked, returning to the tequila. "I'm a big fan of Don Julio Blanco," I began. "I also like Sammy Hagar's Santo Tequila, it's new but excellent. If it's a really special occasion, go for Don Julio 1942. It's expensive at $85 a bottle, but it's worth every penny." She nodded, as if concluding our conversation. I grabbed a bottle of Santo from the shelf and, on a whim, extended my hand. "Mike, how would you like to join me next door for a tequila tasting on my dime? You could make a more informed decision." She grinned cheekily, looked me up and down, then accepted my invitation. We headed to a nearby bar and spent the next 2 hours sampling various tequilas. I made sure we had a couple of snacks to accompany our drinks. When we finally left the bar, I had Rose's number safely tucked away in my phone. I can't even begin to describe the whirlwind of emotions and thoughts that were racing through my mind. For the entire week that followed, I was elated to have a beautiful woman's number. However, that excitement came with the daunting task of actually calling her to set up a date. The last time I had been on a date felt like it was back before the American Revolution. I toyed with the idea of taking her to a nice restaurant, maybe even a roller skating rink or a bowling alley. My mind was a blur of options and anxiety. I had a good job and made a decent living. People generally liked me, and I stayed updated on current events, though I knew better than to bring up politics on a date. Despite my advantages, I was sweating bullets. It dawned on me that one thing had remained unchanged: when it came to dating, women held all the power, and they were acutely aware of it. The fact that Rose had given me her number without any pressure should have worked in my favor, right? Yet, the internal debate continued, fueled by uncertainty and self-doubt. Then, fate, disguised as Anastino, intervened. I literally stumbled upon her in the hallway at work. She tripped on her high heels, and I instinctively grabbed her arms to keep her from falling. I apologized profusely, and Anna, still flustered, said, "I know I'm not very big, but I didn't think you'd notice me if I hadn't bumped into you." Anna, who was probably around the same age as my youngest daughter, and I had talked occasionally. I'd often given her some fatherly advice, and she had been my go-to person for understanding generational issues. Whenever I needed a translation for something my kids were into, Anna would break it down for me in a way that made sense to my 50-year-old brain. "Yes, actually," I muttered, probably sounding like a weak fool. Anna scrutinized my face as if trying to decipher a cryptic message. Her signature smile spread across her face. "This sounds like it's about a woman, isn't it?" she asked in her sing-song manner. "Yes, I think so," I admitted. Anna's smile widened. She made a decision quickly. "Okay, spill it at Murphy's after work. But if you're going to be smart with me, you'll be on your own when I get my ice-cold drink," she said, a playful tone in her voice. Later that day, we met at Murphy's. Anna, with her cheerful demeanor, sat across from me. I was a bundle of nerves as I stammered through my story about Rose. "So, you haven't dated anyone since your divorce 5 years ago? Not a single person?" Anna asked, her eyebrows raised. "Wow. I knew you were a bit of a recluse, but not to this extent." She mimicked surprise, making me cringe but also recognizing her concern and kindness. "So, how long ago did Rose give you her number?" Anna asked. 5 days ago, I replied. "And if you keep being smart, I might just turn you over my knee," she said, only half serious. "Oh, we might both enjoy that," she added with a grin. I couldn't help but blush. "Seriously, Mike, what's the problem?" Anna asked. "You're not a troll. You've got a lot going for you. Just call her." She spent the next half hour sharing tips about dating and what she and her friends did on their dates. I had to resist the urge to pull out a notepad and take notes. "Can you dance?" she asked at one point. "Who else has 3 left feet?" I responded. "Then I'll take that as a no," she said, with a knowing smile. Women really like it when a man asks them to dance. It's a kind of physical connection that speeds things up. "I always thought that was just an urban legend," I said skeptically. "True, 100%, she insisted. "It's kind of like foreplay." I covered my ears and made a face, and Anna just laughed. "Oh, and by the way, don't forget to bring a condom. You can't be too prepared," she said, looking me straight in the eyes. "Yes, Mom," I replied sarcastically. Later that evening, I called Rose and set up a date for the following Saturday. Anna's advice was ringing in my ears as I hung up, feeling both excited and apprehensive about the upcoming rendezvous. I don't usually dwell on the details of my previous marriage, but I answer honestly whenever Rose asks about it. Talking about my past with a relative stranger feels awkward, yet Rose is genuinely empathetic. She shared her own story of heartbreak, recounting how her 15-year marriage ended when she caught her husband in bed with a neighbor. The physical pain from the syphilis I contracted paled in comparison to the humiliation I felt in the doctor's office. The medical staff were entirely professional, but their discomfort was palpable. When I had to list 6 different men as recent partners, one nurse quietly whispered to another after seeing my test results, "It's probably a good thing she's not 25 anymore." Had she said that aloud, I might have lost my composure, but I had to admit, even in my frustration, that the comment struck a nerve. I haven't pondered it too deeply, but I've been making the most of being single in recent years. After Rafe left me following Mike's divorce, I may have gone a bit off the rails. I was probably searching for someone to fill the void left by Mike and Rafe, but nothing even came close to what I had with either of them. How could I possibly replace the 23 years Mike and I shared or the incredible physical connection I had with Rafe? Perhaps I tried to compensate for quality with quantity. It wasn't until I had to report the number of men I'd been with that I realized how irresponsible it had been to sleep with most of them without protection. It's not like I was drunk, I was always clear-headed and chose partners who appeared clean and well-groomed. But the reality is, when you sleep with someone, you also sleep with everyone they've been with recently. I never really considered that. At least I didn't have to tell anyone else about my problem. After a year of dating, Mike and Rose got married. We both had trust issues, but we worked through them with love and the help of an excellent counselor. I gently pushed Rose away as we lay side by side, both breathing heavily from the exertion. At 75, making love once a week was sufficient. We spent another 10 minutes kissing and cuddling before falling asleep. To say that Rose was my savior would be an understatement. After my divorce from Tracy, I was lost. I didn't even know how to date. Rose helped me find my way again, sometimes literally, and we grew together. While I wouldn't bet everything on it, I found a soulmate to grow old with. After my issues, I was more cautious about choosing partners when I re-entered the dating scene. This was partly due to menopause and partly because, although I looked good at 50, younger men weren't interested anymore. The competition among single women in their 40s and 50s was fierce, with far more women than men in those age groups. A few years ago, I would have told anyone that I was set to grow old with my loving husband, Mike. I was clearly mistaken. I had greatly overestimated my performance with Mike, confusing his kindness with weakness. I thought his love for me would be enough to forgive my past mistakes. Several years ago, I moved into a senior living community. My old house was too large for me alone. I see my children and grandchildren every few months, and it took years for our relationships to return to normal. My relationship with Mike remains amicable, though we stopped having lunch together after I realized it wouldn't bring us any closer. Mike has started dating again after years of being a recluse. I admit I feel a pang of jealousy when I see the way he looks at Rose.